Hi, my name's Lauren Epstein, and I'm your host today on The Lauren Epstein Show, playing here on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia. Today, we are going to talk about a very serious subject. We're going to talk about sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, many of you have heard of people experiencing sexual harassment. It's often in the news, and there have been cases about it for quite a long time. But today, we are going to understand what it means and how to deal with it. And I've got some amazing experts. Before I introduce them, I want to talk a little bit about what I found out about sexual harassment in the workplace, some statistics. And, these are just, I call them relative statistics because hard to say exactly what's true. But so the statistics for women, between 40 and 70% of women have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace. Now, I remember back in the 70s, my mom worked in New York City. She was a graphic artist. And one of her coworkers would bring and read pornographic magazines in his office, which today would be like just unheard of. So I know that it does exist. And my mom would tell me stories about these things. 31% of the female workers claimed to have been harassed at work. 43 were harassed by a supervisor. 27% were harassed by an employee senior to them, and 19% were harassed by a coworker at their level. So this is not like just the boss. It could be a lot of things. And also, what's interesting to me is that men get sexually harassed at work. Clearly it happens, but between 10 and 20% of men have experienced sexual harassment in the workplace, and more often than not, 60% of men claimed their harasser was a woman. And this has a huge impact. Tens of millions of dollars a year in fines to companies. There's almost 7,000 claims get filed a year. This is a big deal. And so I want to introduce my guests, my experts. With me today, I have Sharifa Gomez. And I've known Sharifa for a few years now. She is a human resource professional, both here in the United States and Canada, with over a dozen years of experience dealing with people in the workplace. Currently, she's the executive director for the Northern Virginia Society for Human Resource Management, and she's the principal of her own firm, Jomez Consulting, where she helps people develop their careers and improve their resumes. Also, welcome to the show, Sharifa.
Thank you.
Glad you're here. And also on the show with me is Carolyn Wheeler. Carolyn, did I get that right?
Yes.
Was an appellate attorney. And I want you to explain what an appellate attorney is, at the EEOC for over 25 years. She worked on several sexual harassment cases in the Supreme Court involving the defense for cases of supervisor harassment, the meaning of severe or pervasive harassment, and protections on same-sex harassment cases. In 2015, Carolyn joined the Washington, D.C. law firm, Katz, Marshall & Banks, which specializes in representing employees in discrimination, harassment, and whistleblower cases. Welcome to the show, Carolyn.
Thanks, Lauren.
So glad you're here. So what is an appellate attorney?
Well, the EEOC is an agency that takes charges of all kinds of discrimination and harassment. And in some cases, it brings lawsuits all over the country. The EEOC has offices pretty much everywhere and can bring lawsuits in federal courts all over the country. If the commission lost a case and it went up on appeal, appellate lawyers are the attorneys that handle the case on appeal in the U.S. Courts of Appeals. So that's what I did for 25 years, is handle appeals in commission cases from all over the country. And that group of lawyers, there are about 15 of them, also writes friend of the court briefs on issues. And that's how we weighed in on all those cases in the Supreme Court. They were not EEOC cases. They were private cases where the government's views were sought, and the appellate attorneys worked on those briefs.
Interesting. So you've been working on this for a while. What, I'll say the problem, but how would you frame the problems right now around sexual harassment?
I think what's most dispiriting is how pervasive it still is. The numbers you quoted give some idea of it. The charges filed with the agencies that investigate these things have not gone down at all. So there's a feeling that bringing lawsuits and challenging this is maybe not the best way to end harassment in the workplace. And the Commission itself has had a task force studying this and trying to come up with some strategies for employers that might be more effective in ending harassment. So I think what happens is with each new generation of workers, there's a steep learning curve to realize that the workplace has some expectations of how people treat one another, and what might be acceptable in a bar is not acceptable in the workplace. Lauren, when you mentioned your mother's experience with pornographic magazines that coworkers brought in, and you said that wouldn't happen today. Actually, today, one's coworkers will be looking at pornographic websites and materials on their computers in open view of everyone else there, so that there are a lot of current cases where that's the kind of environment that women are experiencing, or everybody's experiencing. It's particularly...
Yeah, I mean, as a man, I would not want to see a guy.
Exactly right.
That's very uncomfortable.
The point for women, I mean, that it's an interesting legal argument that, well, this isn't really directed at the women here. Everybody could see it. Everybody may find it offensive. So this isn't sex discrimination, so you can't challenge it. But most courts will still say that the nature of pornography in general tends to be more demeaning toward women and to objectify women in ways that make the women who are forced to see this in their workplace feel very uncomfortable and very much as if whoever's watching that really doesn't want them there. And this is the message that we're just trying to make you miserable. Same with calling people names. The range of what is considered harassment is maybe surprising to some people, that it's not just sexual touching or invitations to have sex. It's also name-calling and ridiculing people, and there's...
Let's touch on some of the things that are sexual harassment in a second.
Okay.
But Sharifa, what do you think, and either of you chime in, what is really the problem? If it hasn't changed, really, the problem as we measure it, what's going on?
So Carolyn and I were just talking about that before we walked in, was that education obviously needs to be improved. And I mean from a level that maybe in school you're talking about these things, you're improving what people feel is more acceptable behavior when you're children as throughout school. Are we teaching our kids in school how to behave, how to respond, how to respect one another from a young age, so that when they get to be in the workplace, it's not even an issue? Because the problem is, I listened to your example, and I remember one of the few jobs I had when I first started in the United States was exactly that case. A manager was looking at pornographic stuff on his screen. No one thought he thought he was looking around, making sure no one could see him. And then someone reported that they saw him behind the scenes. They passed by his desk, saw it. He was let go within 24 hours. And it was out of respect for other people in the office. They felt like that was not the way the manager should be conducting himself. Why did he feel comfortable enough to do that in the open space? It was cubicles. He didn't have his own office. So that was the kind of understanding. We had to sit down with him and ask, what was truly going on? He's like, honestly, I just needed some time to myself, but that's not appropriate in the office. That's not the right place to do it.
So he didn't have bad intentions.
He didn't have bad intentions.
Right? But he did something that is not socially acceptable. And then the question is like, if he was in his home, that's what he would do.
Absolutely. But the other question is, he's doing it with company property. So that was where our other stance was, you're using all your company property to do what you feel is best for you at the time, but you have to understand that this is not the appropriate scenario.
Perhaps if he'd gone out like for a cigarette break and then done that on his phone or something, then no one would really...
That's correct. So I feel like a lot of it's education and reinforcing the education.
But I mean, these things are so prevalent now in the news media. Don't you think people like get a whiff of like, this can happen? Like you can be fired for just being a little bit... You have something to say, Carol, I can see.
Well, no, that's what one would think. But from my perspective, the problem is that most employers do not really take strong affirmative action to discipline. I mean, as you say, a person could get fired. You hear of the occasional case like that. But look at the famous cases recently. People left their jobs with millions of dollars and no diminishment in their opportunities to do other great things after, for example, Gretchen Carlson filed a lawsuit. So it's a mixed message.
That's very true.
There's a kind of, if the employer employee who's
Well, they
doing
didn't pay out a fee.
but apparently not enough to really deter anybody from,
Right.
Or to cause a serious policing of that environment,
Right.
so this wouldn't happen again. So I think we hear more about cases after there's something like that gets a lot of publicity than a lot of other people say, gee, that's happened to me. Every time there's a major decision about harassment or retaliation, there's an uptick of people complaining about it. So it's clearly not going away, and I guess I'm going to say I would fault mostly employers for not doing what they need to do to create a culture where this is not accepted. They say we have a policy, but it's just a policy. It's just words that
It's not enforced.
it's zero tolerance for harassment of any kind, not just sexual. And yet it goes on all the time, and there are no real penalties or consequences.
So I know that Ford, for example, this past
Wait, I
week.
want to just intersect. So the Gretchen Carlson thing was interesting. She has tons of money. How much more? I mean, in my mind, Gretchen had an opportunity. She's clearly wealthy, probably has enough money for her lifetime. Why would she say, okay, I'll take this money and not move to a legal case? I'm guessing that's what happened. Versus, just like fight it, make a big deal about it. I mean, is that what happened? She took a settlement or something?
She did file a lawsuit, though, and that's why it got publicity. It was not a private settlement, which is much more common. So it was a resolution in which I think the public at large assumes this harassment actually did occur, and he's paying a serious penalty for it. So it's not a bad thing to take the money earlier in the litigation.
Okay.
You wouldn't get to anything better than that if you tried the whole case. Maybe more ugly stuff would come out about this guy, but quite a bit came out the way it was handled.
Okay, well, this is good because now I'm getting educated. So if one commits sexual harassment at work, is that breaking a law or is it a civil? Is there a law that would say you've got to go to jail or something like that?
It's not a criminal law unless it involves a kind of assault or
touching.
rape.
I see. So
Which is sometimes part of what goes on with harassment. But the law we're mostly focused on in the workplace is Title VII, federal law, and state laws in every state that make it unlawful discrimination to harass on this basis.
Let's talk about that for a second so people understand exactly what we're talking about, because I'm sure folks like me are just not aware of. So what we're talking about is Title VII, and in that, what does it say, generally speaking, about, and let's talk about that a little bit so people get a context of the infraction and the scope of that.
So Title VII is a part of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which prohibited discrimination on the basis of race, national origin, color, religion, and sex. It just says it's unlawful to make an employment decision, meaning hiring, firing, promoting, based on any of those things. So how did it come to be that harassing people violates that statute? One piece of it is it's unlawful to discriminate in the terms and conditions of employment, which is a broad phrase that could really mean any and everything. The courts, through the efforts of litigators who brought claims like this and made these arguments, eventually began to accept the idea that creating a hostile work environment for women is creating a different term or condition of employment. So in the famous phrases of Justice Ginsburg, forcing a woman to run a gauntlet of abuse to get into her workplace and do her job is discrimination. It's interfering with employment opportunities. And as you said, it isn't only women, and men are equally protected from this, but most of the big cases until the same-sex harassment case were about women who'd been harassed. And the original form of it, what courts seemed to get the most readily, was the form where a boss says, if you'll sleep with me, I'll give you a promotion. And that was called a quid pro quo kind of harassment, like you do this for me and I'll make things good for you in this company. That was easily seen as, well, a man in her position wouldn't have to do that, to give some kind of perform a sexual act with this guy to get a promotion. So it's different treatment because of sex. That's what the discrimination statutes are all about. So we don't really have a law that prohibits harassment per se. It's a law against discrimination, and people who bring these claims have a lot of hurdles to prove that's what's going on.
It's interesting that the law is actually not specific enough, given how much history there is with it. Does there need to be a change with the law?
Well, I think it's fairly robust protection as the courts have developed it. I personally also think it wouldn't be a bad idea to have a law that prohibits harassment on any basis, not just sex. And because one of the things that happens when you fit it into a discrimination model, just so you understand this, is that the critical issue is whatever bad thing that happened, is it because of the person's race or because of the person's sex? So let's say it was sexual harassment. The woman didn't complain about it as it was going on, and finally she gets fired because she's resisted this guy. And she says, I got fired because I wouldn't go along with his demands. Boss says, no, she got fired because she's a lousy performer. So she still would have this burden of proving this termination was because of her sex, which is very hard to do when a company offers other reasons. So I think if there were
more connecting of the dots.
Yeah.
Right.
I think if there were a straightforward law saying if people bully and harass and intimidate and threaten and abuse people in the workplace on any basis, it's unlawful, and there should be some penalties for that.
Criminal penalties. Well,
Not necessarily. In the workplace, things that employers would do to make sure that's not happening to their workers. Because as you said at the outset, it has real costs for employers, not just paying fees and fines, but the morale of all of their employees, the turnover, the people who don't want to work there because it's known to be a horrible place.
I have a friend who is a recruiter, and he's been hiring people from Google because of this guy who put out that memo, which is not sexual harassment, but in a way it's another type of harassment or another type of disagreement, disharmony at the workplace. And then we look at Uber, which I don't endorse. In fact, we don't use that company because of the culture, and this culture has been going on for years, and I've known it. I mean, I know it's me just coming, but I read stories, and that this guy is, kind of a wacko when it comes to dealing with other people. It's a big problem.
It is.
For investors, for human beings. So thank you, Carolyn, for kind of clarifying that. I think it gives us a better sense for how we can kind of move forward in the conversation. Sharifa, what's your sense of the nut of the problem? And then we can talk about maybe some examples and what to look out for.
Absolutely. I think Carolyn made a really good point in terms of, changing laws, but also education and thinking through how moving forward, you can kind of improve what's going on. I think about most recently the Ford case. There's a case that just got settled this week. Ford Motor Company. Yeah. I think it was Wednesday or Thursday. They just settled on $10 million for both the gender and sexual harassment. And it took months and years to kind of get everything together. But I was like, wow, there wasn't a lot of publicity though. That's what I found really interesting. It was literally on SHRM's website this past week, and I'm like, how did they do that? Because they shelled out a lot of money. SHRM
is the Society for Human Resource Management.
Yeah.
So SHRM.org if you want to check that out.
Yeah. So I thought that was very interesting that I didn't hear about that until kind of Googling and seeing what's going on with sexual harassment right now. And then the other big thing I found interesting this summer, they talked a lot about sexual harassment for pool parties and things that managers are trying to, get your teams together and team build. And they're having these parties, but people are complaining about after the fact that they're being touched uncomfortably and things like that. So how do you protect your employees when they're coming to a team party in the summer? They want to be very happy and glad they're all getting together, but then afterwards the complaints were high. A lot of people were complaining, but after the fact that's not the environment I thought we were having. My boss didn't do anything about it. So it's very interesting how things have changed in another way, but it's the same issue.
Plus, going to work in a bathing suit is kind of weird.
Right.
That's weird. I know some people I don't want to see.
Right.
Suit.
Well,
that's totally fine.
That's what people said as well. And I saw parts of people's bodies. I didn't really feel comfortable, and I understand that. But it's funny how things have really not changed. They've just changed in terms of the environment. That things are happening.
So things are not, we're talking about it in some subjective way.
Absolutely.
But it's not subjective. Is it? Or is it?
I think the definition of harassment depends on the person. And it depends on what they've experienced, depending on like what the laws are saying, as well as what the person's going through.
So, Carolyn, what is it a subjective thing? Or
Well,
is
it has to meet an objective test of being sufficiently severe or pervasive to alter the working conditions. So it can't just be, that's how I felt.
Right.
It has to meet a standard. If you're going to litigate this in court, a jury would have to agree that whatever happened to this woman was that bad. And sometimes people lose these cases because juries are like, that doesn't sound that bad. I mean, I hear worse than that all the time.
Right.
And people around me talk like that. So, there's a projection of, well, I wouldn't want to be blamed if I grabbed somebody. What's the harm? So I think besides the things we've already mentioned, I think there are certain types of workplaces where people are especially vulnerable, where one of the worst cases that I worked on, most frustrating case, I should say, involved long-haul truckers, where a man and a woman are alone in a truck for 18-hour stretches. Many, many, many women reported harassment. The employer's view was, what can I do? He denies it. This he said, she said is a cliche in this area. And one of the places where I think employers really need to think creatively about how they can investigate these matters and make some determinations or take some actions, even if they can't be 100% sure which person is telling the truth. There's no harm in warning an individual that, well, I don't know for certain that you did this, but if I ever hear anything like this again from another person you're driving with, you'll be fired. But most of the men thought, most of the drivers thought nothing ever would happen, and they joked with the women, go tell them. They won't do anything to me about it. I'm the king when I'm in this truck, and you do what I say. So that kind of workplace is very difficult for women.
It's impossible.
And difficult to deal with this problem.
Right.
The other kind of recurring thing we see is what they call high-value employees, where and this was
I've seen this.
This was the Uber case, I believe, that HR told her when she complained about what her supervisor was saying was, they won't do more than give him a slap on the wrist because he's too valuable.
Right.
And that kind of power disparity between the victims or the targets of harassment and the harassers is fairly pervasive. People who want to harass someone aren't stupid about who they would target in terms of relative power in the workplace.
Sometimes.
Well, of course, sometimes they are. Sometimes they're surprised that someone finally turns on them.
Sure. Yeah.
As was Roger Ailes.
Yeah, I'm sure President Clinton was shocked. So, well, I don't want to make light of this. I'm listening to what you're saying, and it's like kind of throwing me off of what because I have all these questions. No, it's great. It's great. So we're going to take a quick break. My name's Lauren Epstein. I'm your host. You're listening to The Lauren Epstein Show here on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia, and we'll be back in just a minute. Hi, I'm Lauren Epstein. Every week I talk about jobs and careers on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia at 10 a.m. Mondays. Welcome back. I'm Lauren Epstein, the host of The Lauren Epstein Show. Today we're talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. And before we go on, I just want to give a big shout out to Afote, who just got engaged. Rock on, Afote. He's our production engineer. If it sounds good, it's because of him, not because of me. So let's get back to our show. So we kind of talk about some of the fundamentals, the framework at least of the fundamentals. If I am in a workplace, how do I know that I'm being harassed? Forget about sex, right? How do I know this is going on, or if it's going on for somebody else? What are the signs, the symptoms? What are the indications, Sharifa?
I think it depends on the person and the process that the company has, right? So you're going through and maybe understanding the handbook that your company has, and it says when you deal with things of feeling uncomfortable or there's sexual advances or there's definitions as to what they prescribe as being that, you're feeling like, well, I feel like these are checking off a list of things I'm feeling uncomfortable about, and then I take it to someone. It's what do I do with that? So I think about like the hotlines that they have.
So let's just break that down a little bit. So the first thing you're saying is you should work for a place that has a handbook.
Well, and a clear one, that you understand
one.
what the expectations are for all employees.
And that within the handbook, there should be some kind of prescriptive direction around sexual harassment.
Right. Because Carolyn mentioned...
That should be in there.
She's right. Most companies say that, we're going to have no harassment. We are, no tolerance. So what does that mean? How is that defined in that company? Making sure you understand what that looks like.
Okay, so the first place to go is if you think it's happening to you, how would I know it's happening to me?
I think there's a couple things. And normally you'd either talk to someone about it. Like usually, I know most people in HR that have come to me, they've talked to a colleague or they talk to their spouse and they're like, I feel uncomfortable, but I'm not sure what to do with it. Usually they would come to HR. That's usually the first step, is they'd come to HR.
Is that a safe bet? I mean, if you're working at Uber and the HR person reports to the president?
No. But maybe there's a third party. There should be. I know that most companies these days, they have a third party, like a hotline that you'd say, it's anonymous. I feel like this is a situation I'm not sure about. What do I do next? Most companies should. I don't know if that's the case where all companies have them. So at that point, you have to figure out who's the best person to talk to about this.
So talk to somebody, talk it through. Here's what's going on.
Yes.
And then get some feedback to see how to proceed.
Correct.
And what you'd said earlier, Carolyn, was to document everything, irrespective, which is a good plan. But then one of the things that I know from my HR certification is that if I'm witnessing someone getting sexually harassed, that's also a form of harassment. Is that right? Am I wrong? Like if someone's sexually harassing, person A is sexually harassing person B, and I'm person C who's witnessing all of that, am I included in that kind of like, oh, this is a horrible thing? Like the guy at work who watches.
There are a lot of cases in which courts have agreed that witnessing harassment, being in a workplace where harassment occurs, can create a hostile environment for other people, as long as they're in the same class, meaning if a man is harassing a particular woman and other women are witnessing that, the other women too might have a claim.
But a man might not.
A man might not, because he's not really being injured by the harassment of women.
Oh, that's horrible.
Yes, I don't know if you can tell I don't exactly agree with that. Your question about how do you know if it's happening, I do think before people talk to anyone in the workplace, my experience is many women they do a reality check. They ask their friends, has anything like this ever? Because you're right, sometimes you don't know, is this inappropriate? Is he just being friendly? My boss asked me to dinner. I said no, and then he asked me to do something else. Why does he keep doing that? And a friend might say, well, make clear to him you're just not interested, that this is a work relationship. Tell him, to leave you alone. Because the first line of reaction to inappropriate conduct is self-help and asking people to stop. And that's the hardest part. Mm-hmm. And a lot of people don't feel comfortable doing that, and that's exactly why it persists and goes on. So I guess I could put in a plug, if you're really unsure and you don't know what kind of workplace you're in terms of taking this seriously, you can consult a lawyer. And, our firm and many others will do a free consultation to help you figure out what's going on in your workplace. Are your rights being violated? And what's the best way to go forward? The goal, we would think, is to stop what's happening, to improve conditions in that workplace, not to let it get so bad that the person says, I just have to quit. I can't work in a place like this, which is where it often ends up.
One of the things that I stopped doing at work is telling women in particular how they may look. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Like, oh, you look really nice today. And that would be my comment, because they look really nice today or something. And I can't point to it because I don't necessarily look at them much. But, it's and I'm a husband, but before I was a husband, I thought it would be nice, to be complimentary. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that to guys too. Like we had a guest earlier who got a haircut, and I said, hey, that's a really nice haircut. So, but I can't do that anymore at work. And I kind of watch myself because I don't know how people are going to take it. Mm-hmm. And even if it's not sexual harassment, there's still that in between 0 to 60 where I could get in trouble.
Perception.
Right?
Yes. More common than, the line that people cross is not saying you look nice. It's saying, I really like the way you look in that dress. Or, wear your skirt shorter.
Oh,
right.
That's the stuff where, women really aren't confused about what's happening when these comments are made and do feel that it's inappropriate. What we find in counseling people, though, is they don't exactly know how to deal with it one-on-one while it's happening. They tend to just change the subject and hope he'll just quit doing this. They do not always complain. So the numbers of people who've actually experienced it is way different from the number who've complained about it, either to their employer or to an agency.
So I'm going to play, for just a minute, I'm going to play the devil's advocate, because I know there's some listeners who are thinking this. What about the cases where women who are looking to be vengeful or mean or take revenge make a false accusation? And what does someone do to kind of protect themselves from that?
Wouldn't due diligence basically dig up what's truly going on, though?
Well, I mean, if a woman at work is doesn't like a particular guy, says he sexually harassed me, and I know I get what you're saying. Like in America, in a lot of places, it's still kind of okay, but here in D.C., I've never worked at a place where it's anywhere near okay.
Right.
Like there's almost sometimes a hyper vigilance about it in some organizations. What does a man or a woman do if they feel like they're being falsely accused of sexual harassment?
I'd almost say the same thing I said initially about what a person should do who feels she's being targeted with harassment, and that is kind of keep notes and record of conversations. And I mean, I guess that would presuppose that that the gentleman would know that a woman has some animosity toward him, or might. And sometimes that might be engendered by he got a promotion that she wanted, so it's just straight resentment of something else going on in the workplace. And should he anticipate that she's going to make a false complaint of harassment? I mean, that's being paranoid and weird. But once the complaint is made, well, that's when it shifts to the obligation of the employer, HR, whoever handles these things, to do a really serious investigation and draw some conclusion about who's telling the truth. What I experienced, again, from the plaintiff's side, is a number of cases where employers quickly decided a woman was lying and fired her. So their whole investigation was of the woman and about a minute and a half talking to the guy, and decided that the one I'm thinking of, the woman had received some obscene phone calls, and she reported it and said, and I think it's my supervisor. And she had recorded the calls, but she couldn't, she didn't really say it was him. She said she thought it was from other. Anyway, they looked at her phone. She had called the police and everything, but they could not verify where the calls were coming from, and decided she made it up and targeted him for some unknown reason, and then they fired her. So, and that was a commission case, and the EEOC's view of that was you really need to do a better investigation, a more even-handed investigation. And so if in the end an employer wouldn't know which one's telling the truth, it's probably not a good idea to fire anybody, but rather to counsel everybody and maybe make it a kind of training point that if this happened, if anybody did this to anybody, we would consider that a serious violation of our policy or of Title VII, whatever it is, and we will take disciplinary action. And then just sort of watch those people and check with the person who claims she's been harassed, that you're not sure it really happened, to be sure nothing else has happened. Check with him to be sure. So I just think the protection has to come from the employer handling the complaints appropriately and fairly to everybody involved.
Right. So the takeaway here from what I'm hearing, and tell me if I've got this, is that as a worker, an employee, that I have a responsibility to, one, protect myself by being aware of what's going on, that if anything's happening, to document it, maybe talk to a friend, whatever the harassment is. So we're not talking about sexual harassment. It could be any kind of harassment, anything that makes me feel uncomfortable at work. And then that the employer has a responsibility to do a thorough, fair, even-handed investigation so that they can come to a relatively logical conclusion. That's what you're saying? Mm-hmm. Cool. Well, so Sharifa, I mean, you've been working for companies for a while. What would you say is some of the things that HR folks can do to kind of make sure that they do the even-handed, and CEOs and other folks to do an even-handed investigation?
So I have a friend of mine. She recently was telling me about a sexual harassment case at work where it was the same sex, and it was going on for about 10 years, and people had been making comments and suggestions that this was happening for many, many years.
10 years.
10 years. And she, at first you think you hear rumors and you're checking in what's going on, but after about 2 years, she kind of did a deeper dive and said, what's truly going on with this manager and these younger staff members? And then figuring out she got a third party to come in and do a little investigation. Doesn't seem to be a lot going on, so we should be okay. But then about 8 years later, it became there were 4 or 5 people coming forward to talk about the fact that this has been going on. So again, same sex. There was a gentleman who was a managing director, and it was a gentleman that he felt like also were homosexual, and that he felt like this is acceptable. He's like, I've been doing it for years. It's okay. But what was really alarming about the whole case is that people did not go to HR. She had to hear about it through third party and do her own investigation to figure this out. And then they got this third party to do this larger investigation. And the gentleman finally, of course, was let go, the managing director. And all the residual impact is what they're dealing with now. All the other staff members that don't feel comfortable because they're still friends with him socially. They felt like he had said, come to my home, let's have a meal, let's be comfortable. And they weren't sure what was really truly happening behind the scenes. So it's funny when I think about this, it makes me feel like there's so much more HR should be doing. You hear about rumors, but you still need to investigate. But there's so many more things you can be doing education-wise. So I don't feel like a lot of companies do a really good job teaching their teams what to do in these cases, how to evaluate what's going on with you. Who do you talk to that's comfortable?
So why did they go to HR?
They didn't feel comfortable. There was one individual in HR. They didn't feel like there was enough going on to kind of do that checklist. They felt like, maybe I'm just overthinking this. Maybe it's just not something that's truly going on. Can then come to find out it was sexual advances. It absolutely was.
But if it was seen through, then people are having these relationships. The person still didn't feel like they could come.
They don't, because they felt like they were going to be retaliated against because the managing director was.
So then they crossed that line of
correct.
Now they're culpable.
I've already come to his house for dinner and hung out with him.
Right.
So obviously I'm partaking in this.
Right.
So that's why they didn't really feel like what's next. So for me, the education has been the hard part because I've had other companies tell me, you're getting into consulting now, and our sexual harassment is really done poorly. Like, we don't have good training. It's really seen as kind of comical the way that they have videos. Like, what can we do to make sure this is really something we talk about at large? It's a huge impact to the company as well as to employees.
So about maybe 10 years ago, I went to the National Association of Collegiate Programming people. So it was like a conference where folks who did entertainment or edutainment for colleges would come and kind of showcase their acts. And then the kids who were part of their program council who had the budgets would go and watch them and kind of decide who they were going to book for the year for different things. And there was one really fascinating one. I think it came out of a lot of the sexual harassment or sexual crimes on campus was a skit where you had a man and a woman, a young man and a woman of college age, who would kind of simulate them going on a date. And they would give the first 20 people in the audience little signs, red and green. And then they would pause them. And when something happened, they'd be like, okay, should I keep going or should I stop? And it was really fascinating. It wasn't hokey. The kids really engaged with it. I thought it was great because then you kind of get to see from a simulation. Is it that, and I've seen some of these videos that are just ineffective because they are hokey.
They are.
So is it a function now of, if we're going to talk about solutions, that it's just not there?
It isn't. I haven't seen it done well. I've only seen it really being done at some consulting firms because they have the client, they have a government contractor, and they've had to really have that as a part of their training course that you've got to check off once a year. You do a shuffle of, hey, make sure this is a course that everybody takes. But those are done well in terms of the strengthening of understanding what you should do if this happens to you. But other companies don't do it as well as they should.
And that's, again, because it's just not.
Yeah. Carolyn said it very well. I think the companies don't do enough. And they feel like they don't have a process in place that really makes people feel comfortable to speak forward. And is anything really truly going to happen? And isn't it going to happen in my favor that I truly am experiencing this? What do I do next? So.
What do you think some of the solutions are, Carolyn? How do we mitigate the problem? You said education earlier. Is that it? Maybe it's a combination of that and laws, or is it deeper, more specific?
Well, I do think it's a matter of creating a culture that's sincerely intolerant of your employees abusing one another. And it starts at the top.
Yeah.
How do you make people want to do that? I mean, one of the ineffective things of the law is that the penalties are not very stiff because there's a cap on damages under Title VII of $300,000 for the very largest employers. Wow. Frankly, that isn't very much money these days. That was put in place in 1990 and hasn't been revisited. Under state law, there are no caps, and you sometimes see...
Wait, there are no caps?
No caps, so you sometimes see an award of millions of dollars. And I would think if that happened a few times, there has to be something to make people take it more seriously, because it is like a slap on the wrist to the harasser, to the company itself, to be found liable for allowing this to go on. So unless it's so pervasive that it really hurts the company's reputation, as with Uber, and I don't mean to keep picking on Uber and Fox News, but I don't know how Fox News isn't probably suffering a great loss in its audience because of the allegations of harassment.
Didn't one of their hosts had to leave?
True.
Bill O'Reilly.
True.
That was probably a big hit to their bottom line.
I don't know. I mean, I haven't seen that data. But there needs to be that kind of consequence unfortunately, for people in a profit-oriented business setting to take seriously the need to do something about this. So there's that, and then there's...
So if you're a senator or a congressman listening, these laws need to be revisited.
Absolutely.
They need to be updated and to reflect what is needed. And you should consult with HR people and CEOs and lawyers to come up with some guardrails to help prevent this.
Right.
But then, and then maybe, because you were saying that it hasn't really trailed off, even though we have some of these big cases, what else could we do to help mitigate this, educating kids? I don't know. I mean, it seems so foreign and strange to me that people would kind of act in these ways.
Still act in these ways.
And still acting these ways. Like maybe in the 50s or 60s when I kind of, like maybe we were a little more troglodyte in our way we deal with people.
So I think to understand why does it happen is important. So rather than are all just feeling outraged or amazed that it goes on, to dig deeper to understand this and other forms of hate that are pervasive today.
And violence.
And violence. And I think there are common threads, that there are a lot of the impetus to harass women or any other minority group in a workplace is the same kind of fear and feeling of dislocation. So there, for example, workplaces where women are, and still kind of rare, as in oddly selling used cars or new cars, some kinds of manufacturing, mining, Wall Street. I mean, they're just even the medical profession. There are places where women have not made numerical inroads as they have in other professions. And in those places, the hostility level toward women, not necessarily just sexual come-ons, but hatred of women and abuse of women and intimidating acts clearly designed to make them want to leave. Why is that going on? Because people have, I believe, been miseducated about the nature of our economy and the issues that we really have. So that, the anti-immigrant sense and other things that are going on today, because people feel threatened, and as if they don't have a secure economic future, they take that out on these more vulnerable groups. So, I mean, who's the most exploited and abused in the workplace would be undocumented women workers in the fields and in households. I mean, they are the targets so when you think of that going on there and why that might be, I think you just extrapolate from that's probably what's going on everywhere. A lot of resentment and hatred of women and other minorities seem to be taking our jobs.
I think you're totally right. I think fundamentally, my belief system is that underneath everything, all of our emotions, there's either two kind of fundamental things, that the genesis, the source is either you're communicating or doing something from love or a derivation of love or from a place of fear, right? And that all anger and all violence come from fear. And, we are animals.
Right.
That we are afraid of a lot of things. We're afraid for our and I think sometimes not rationally. It's not rational-based fear. There may not be like a real fear of your life, but we don't really see that, and we still act on those fears. Violence on the road. I mean, it seems kind of, violence just about everywhere.
Yeah. So I think that, I say glibly, CEOs need to create a culture of intolerance of this abuse, but it's more than just conveying the negative message that we won't tolerate you treating people badly. There has to be, I think, a way of conveying.
We're gonna take a quick break. We're gonna come back to the solutions. We'll spend the last part of our show talking about what we could do if we waved a magic wand. That's one of my favorite parts of my show. Hi, I'm Lauren Epstein, and you're listening to The Lauren Epstein Show, where we talk about jobs, careers, and the workplace, here on 96.7 FM. If you're interested in being on the show, you can give me a call at 240-876-0276 or email me at Lorne, Lorne, at electriccow.com. You can check out our Facebook page, which is Lauren Epstein, and also our Mixcloud account. So if you go to mixcloud.com, Lauren Epstein, you'll find our shows. Thanks so much. Hi, I'm Lauren Epstein, the host of The Lauren Epstein Show. Thank you for listening. And we are talking about sexual harassment in the workplace. With me, I have Sharifa Gomez and Carolyn Wheeler. And we are just going to get to kind of the tail part of our show is, what are some of the solutions? We've kind of talked about the fundamental structures of sexual harassment, some of the signs and symptoms, what one would do if this is occurring to you. But if we could wave our magic wands and change the way it all works, what would we do? Whoever wants to go first. I won't call it you.
If I could just finish that half sentence,
Yeah.
What I was thinking, that I don't believe it's enough to keep insisting that employers have clear policies and procedures for reporting harassment. If we want to end the underlying conduct, if we're right, if I'm right and you're right, Lauren, that this stems from fear and feeling threatened by the presence of these people in the workplace, then the culture that needs to change is one of creating a positive message of inclusion. I hate to sound like a diversity recruiter or something, but that's what it's about. If a company is going to employ diverse groups of people, it can't just have a negative message of don't mistreat them. It has to convey a positive message of aren't we lucky to have all these people here? And not team build by having pool parties, but somehow team build by creating an idea that this is, just as we would like to say, the greatness of our country is its diversity and the multitudes of people who've come from other places, that any company could build a feeling among all of its employees that this is a good thing and it's not a threatening thing, and it's not going to be the end of your future here if we also promote a woman in a parallel job. You're secure and she's going forward too. Because it's not a pie that has to be divided and you're going to lose if someone else wins. But that's, to me, a little more basic or a little more, and maybe harder, I don't know, than just focusing on how good is our sexual harassment policy.
Well, I think it starts at the top. I think you're absolutely right. I think that CEOs, and it flows downhill, don't necessarily see people as people. They see people as solutions to their problems. Mm-hmm. And a lot of CEOs, like when you talk about the culture overall, will think badly of their people that they have working for them, just as the people working will think badly, like whatever the problems are, they're the CEO. And the CEO thinks all of their problems are below them. So fundamentally, there's not a level of open communication and appreciation. Like, it's rare. And I tell you, it really makes a huge difference when someone is publicly acknowledged in a positive way. It totally changes, because when you hear the CEO or someone in power say something nice about everyone's like, oh, yeah, that's true. And so whatever biases they have, they kind of can wash away because I don't know maybe what this person's doing, and maybe I have my perceptions because we always judge, right? We're constantly judging what's going on in front of us, but they're not accurate. that it does take leadership to step in, and like you're saying, inclusive and welcoming is an action, whether it's verbally speaking it out loud or however, but making sure that people know that everyone in the company is appreciated and everyone in the company is valuable and everyone in the company is a human being. You know, we all make mistakes. You know, we'll all make mistakes, so there's got to be room for that, right? An ability to communicate with each other. I'm kind of talking about what my solution would be, but that is possible because I mean, a lot of us have friends and spouses, and we have to do that with them. You know, to kind of use some of those skills about being a generous listener and unconditional partner that really make work effective. I know in some of the places I've worked, which have been great, some level of that has been there. You know, definitely, I've been in a lot of places where, you know, that hasn't been, and there's always this tension that can maybe pop up in the form of these things that we're talking about.
Another really minor thought I've had. I went from the global
no
to
thoughts.
the really.
All good thoughts.
Sometimes I wonder if in some of the training we do, I'm not sure there's a focus on this, but that people who are accused of harassing someone should be asked to think I didn't do anything wrong. To just, I mean, maybe what's lacking there is that empathy and that ability to understand how another person feels when this occurs. So ask them whatever would work. How would you feel if your mom told you this had happened to her or your daughter, or, you know, whatever, if you can identify a female person in his life that he loves, respects, wants the best for, and you heard she came and told you, this is what a guy at work has done to me, would you get it? Would you understand that that's really not acceptable? And maybe think that you shouldn't be treating people that way.
I think you're totally right. But fundamentally, I think that what you're saying is exactly what the problem is that we don't, you know, the way we treat women and men is very not nice.
Right.
So it makes me think that after you have these cases and this happens, what happens to the guy, if probably that's the case, what happens when he leaves your organization and goes to the next organization? So does he have a reference that someone is being transparent as to what's truly going on and why he was asked to leave? What happens to him after the fact? How does he gonna kind of go through a solution to make sure he doesn't do it again if someone's not asking those questions?
Mm-hmm.
So just wrapping up. Carolyn, if folks want to reach out to you, how can they do that?
Email wheeler@kmblegal.com.
Cool.
Or find us on the website at KMB Legal.
And Sharifa, if folks want to reach out to you.
Sure. At sgomez@jomezconsulting.com.
And it's JOMEZ.
You got it.
.com.
You got it.
That's awesome. Well, I want to acknowledge both of you for being really thoughtful and courageous and sharing your wisdom. Clearly, you have a lot of knowledge and a lot of experience that I know our listeners are getting value of. And for me, this is one of our important shows because I think that people will listen to this and use this knowledge to make their lives better, make their companies better, and make sure that, you know, we live in a culture of equanimity and justice. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm Lauren Epstein, the host of The Lauren Epstein Show. Thank you so much for listening to another episode. We will see you next week here on 96.7 FM, Arlington, Virginia.